Bronco Springs, Texas Territory, autumn 1887. The wind carried the scent of dust and dying dreams through the weathered planks of the frontier town, where judgment fell harder than rain and mercy was scarcer than water in drought season. Against the peeling paint of Murphy's Saloon, a Cherokee boy named Daniel Fireheart had made his bed on bare ground for 7 nights running. His thin frame curled beneath a threadbare blanket that offered little protection from the cold contempt of passers-by or the bite of October air. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bronco Springs, illuminating a town that wore its prejudices as openly as the sheriff wore his badge. Daniel Fireheart stirred beneath his ragged blanket, the 16th autumn of his life weighing heavier on his shoulders than any boy should bear. His dark hair, once neatly braided in the Cherokee way his grandmother had taught him, now hung loose and unkempt around a face that hunger had carved too sharp for his years.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wooden planks of Murphy's Saloon pressed against his spine, a reminder that even in sleep, the world offered him no comfort. 7 days ago, Daniel had walked into Bronco Springs with nothing but the clothes on his back, a leather pouch containing his last $3, and a letter from the territorial governor promising work at the new railway depot. The letter had proven as worthless as fooled gold, the railway foreman taking one look at Daniel's Cherokee features and declaring the position filled before turning his back. $3 bought little more than a loaf of bread and a cup of coffee in a town where everything cost extra if your skin held the bronze kiss of native blood. Now, as the first light of dawn crept across the settlement, Daniel pressed his face against the cool planks and listened to the sounds of Bronco Springs awakening. Inside Murphy's Saloon, chairs scraped against floorboards as early patrons settled in for their morning whiskey. Boots clomped along the wooden sidewalks as shopkeepers unlocked their doors and began another day of commerce. The blacksmith's hammer had already begun its rhythmic song, each strike echoing off the surrounding buildings like a metallic heartbeat that reminded Daniel how utterly alone he was in this place. Look there, that savage is still polluting our main street, came the sharp voice of Mrs. Prudence Hawthorne, the banker's wife, as she emerged from Kellerman's general store with her arms full of packages. Her pale blue dress, pristine and pressed despite the dusty conditions, marked her as one of Bronco Springs' self-appointed moral guardians. She paused on the sidewalk, her gray eyes narrowing as they fixed on Daniel's huddled form. 7 days now, Herbert. 7 days that creature has been defiling the entrance to a respectable establishment. Herbert Hawthorne, a man whose soft middle and softer hands marked him as one who had never known real hardship, adjusted his spectacles and nodded gravely. His black suit, though appropriate for his position at the town bank, seemed too heavy for the desert climate, causing perspiration to bead on his pale forehead. Indeed, Prudence, the boy's presence is becoming quite the eyesore. Surely Sheriff Crenshaw could do something about this vagrant situation. We have ordinances against loitering, after all. Daniel kept his eyes closed, feigning sleep while shame burned in his chest like swallowed coals. He had learned quickly that in Bronco Springs, invisibility was survival. The less he moved, the less he spoke, the longer the townspeople might ignore him before their disgust boiled over into action. His stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar sensation that had become his constant companion since arriving in this unwelcoming place. Vagrant? Scoffed Thomas Murphy, the saloon owner, as he stepped out to sweep his front porch. Murphy was a thick-set Irishman with arms like tree trunks and a face weathered by 40 years of frontier living. His voice carried the authority of a man who had carved his place in this hard land through stubborn determination. That boy's no vagrant, Hawthorne. Been watching him for a week now. He don't beg, don't steal, don't cause trouble. Just sits there quiet as a church mouse. If more folks in this town minded their own business half as well as that kid minds his, we'd all be better off. Mrs. Hawthorne's nostrils flared with indignation. Her carefully curled hair, pinned beneath a small hat adorned with artificial flowers, seemed to quiver with moral outrage. Mr. Murphy, surely you cannot approve of that ... That person camping on your doorstep like some kind of wild animal. What will visitors think of our community? We're trying to build a civilized town here, not operate some sort of charity house for wandering Indians. What I think, Murphy replied, his Irish accent thickening as his temper rose, is that boy's got more dignity in his little finger than half the so-called Christians in this town got in their whole bodies. He ain't hurting nobody, and he ain't a skin for nothing. Can't say the same for some folks who seem mighty eager to pass judgment on their neighbors. The exchange drew a small crowd, as confrontations always did in a town where entertainment was scarce. James Kellerman emerged from his general store, wiping his hands on his apron, while Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell paused on her morning rounds to observe the heated discussion. Even young Timothy Fletcher, barely 14 and already apprenticed to the blacksmith, stopped his sweeping to listen from the doorway of the forge. Herbert Hawthorne's face reddened beneath his carefully waxed mustache. His voice took on the pompous tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. See here, Murphy, there are standards to maintain in a proper community. We cannot simply allow every drifter and vagrant to take up residence on our main thoroughfare. There are ... health considerations, moral considerations. The boy needs to move along to wherever his kind belongs. His kind? Dr. Hartwell interjected, her medical bag clutched firmly in her gloved hands. Elizabeth Hartwell was one of only 3 women doctors west of the Mississippi, a fact that had caused considerable controversy when she first arrived in Bronco Springs 2 years prior. Her practical gray dress and no-nonsense manner reflected a woman who had fought for every ounce of respect she commanded. Mr. Hawthorne, that boy is 16 years old at most, alone, obviously hungry, and has been sleeping on wooden planks for a week. If you're concerned about health considerations, perhaps we should be discussing how to help him rather than how to remove him. Mrs. Hawthorne drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable given her tendency to wear boots with elevated heels. Her voice dripped with the kind of false sweetness that could curdle fresh milk. Dr. Hartwell, while your medical training may qualify you to treat ailments of the body, surely you recognize that some social problems require more traditional solutions. That boy's presence encouraged others of his race to view our town as welcoming to their kind. We must think of our children, our property values, our reputation in the territory. Daniel's hands clenched into fists beneath his blanket as the familiar weight of hatred pressed down upon him like a physical force. He had heard these same arguments in 3 towns before Bronco Springs, variations on the same theme of unwelcome that followed him like a shadow wherever he wandered. The Cherokee reservation was 200 miles north, but he could not return there, could not face the questions about why he had left, why he had failed to find the new life he had promised his dying grandmother he would build. Reputation? Murphy's voice rose enough to carry clearly down the street, drawing more curious onlookers. What kind of reputation are we building when we turn away a hungry kid? When we stand around arguing about whether a boy deserves a place to rest his head? My father came to this country with nothing but the clothes on his back and the hope for something better. Folks helped him when he needed it. No questions asked about his religion or his accent or the color of his skin. Sheriff Wade Crenshaw chose that moment to emerge from his office, drawn by the raised voices and gathering crowd. Crenshaw was a lean man in his 40s, with steel gray eyes and a mustache that had gone white prematurely from the stress of keeping peace in a lawless territory. His badge caught the morning sunlight as he approached, thumbs hooked casually in his gun belt in the manner of a man comfortable with authority. "What's all this commotion about?" Crenshaw asked, his gaze sweeping across the assembled townspeople before settling on Daniel's still form.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Mrs. Hawthorne, you look ready to take a bite out of somebody. What seems to be the trouble? Mrs. Hawthorne seized the opportunity to present her case to the town's highest authority. Her voice took on the tone of a woman reporting a serious crime. Sheriff, we've been discussing the vagrant situation that has been plaguing our main street for the past week. Surely there are laws against this sort of loitering and vagrancy. The boy needs to be moved along before his presence attracts more of his kind to our community. Sheriff Crenshaw studied Daniel with the careful attention of a man trained to read situations quickly and accurately. His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts as he took in the boy's obvious hunger, the careful way he held himself motionless, the threadbare condition of his clothes. Has he caused any trouble? Stolen anything? Threatened anyone? Been drunk or disorderly? Well, no, Herbert Hawthorne admitted reluctantly, adjusting his spectacles again in a nervous gesture. But surely the very fact of his presence constitutes a form of vagrancy. There must be ordinances about camping in public spaces, about maintaining the proper appearance of our commercial district. There are, Crenshaw confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. Same ordinances that would apply to any person sleeping rough in town limits. Course, those same ordinances also require me to determine whether the person in question has anywhere else to go, whether they're causing a public disturbance, and whether there are extenuating circumstances that might warrant compassion over enforcement. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, her medical training evident in the way she approached the situation with systematic observation. Sheriff, if I may, I've been watching that boy for several days during my morning rounds. He's clearly malnourished, possibly suffering from exposure, and shows signs of exhaustion that suggest he's been traveling for some time. From a medical standpoint, moving him along in his current condition could constitute a death sentence. Death sentence? Mrs. Hawthorne scoffed, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Surely you're being overly dramatic, Doctor. The boy appears perfectly capable of walking. If he cannot provide for himself here, perhaps he should return to wherever he came from. Murphy spat into the dust, his Irish temper finally getting the better of his usual diplomatic nature. And where might that be, Mrs. Hawthorne? You think Cherokee boys just spring up out of the ground somewhere? That kid's probably traveled hundreds of miles looking for work, looking for a place where somebody might give him half a chance. Instead, he finds a town full of folks more worried about property values than human decency. The crowd had grown larger, drawing curious onlookers from up and down the main street. Old Pete Gartner, who ran the livery stable, stood with his arms crossed and his face thoughtful. Sarah Chen, who operated the town's only laundry service despite facing her own share of prejudice as a Chinese immigrant, watched the proceedings with obvious interest. Even Reverend Marcus Stone had emerged from the small white church at the end of the street, his black robes making him look like a crow among the more colorfully dressed townspeople. Sheriff Crenshaw raised his hand for silence, his authority evident in the immediate response of the crowd. Seems to me we've got ourselves a situation that requires some Christian charity rather than legal enforcement. Dr. Hartwell, in your medical opinion, what does the boy need most urgently? Dr. Hartwell approached Daniel's sleeping form with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. She knelt beside him, noting the shallow nature of his breathing, the prominence of his cheekbones, the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. Food, first and foremost, clean water, a warm, dry place to rest. Basic medical examination to ensure he hasn't developed any serious conditions from sleeping rough. Sheriff, this boy needs help, not harassment. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice rose to a pitch that suggested her patience was wearing dangerously thin. This is precisely the sort of bleeding heart sentimentality that leads to more problems down the road. Give aid to one vagrant, and soon we'll have dozens camping on our doorsteps. There are proper institutions for dealing with this kind, reservations, and government programs specifically designed to handle these situations. Government programs? Murphy laughed bitterly. You mean the same government that's been moving tribes around like chess pieces for the past 50 years? The same institutions that have been promising food and supplies that never seem to arrive? Mrs. Hawthorne, with all due respect, you don't know the first thing about what that boy's been through or where he's come from. Daniel's eyes remained closed, but every word of the conversation burned itself into his memory. The familiar pattern of debate about his worth, his place, his right to exist in spaces dominated by white society played out exactly as it had in countless other towns. Some voices raised in anger, others in what passed for compassion, all discussing him as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a person with feelings and dreams and fears. Young Timothy Fletcher finally found his voice, speaking up from the doorway of the blacksmith shop where he had been listening with growing discomfort. Seems to me if we're supposed to be Christians like Reverend Stone keeps preaching, we ought to be helping folks who need help. Don't the good book say something about treating strangers with kindness? Reverend Stone cleared his throat, his tall, thin frame swaying slightly as he considered his words carefully. Timothy raises an excellent point. Matthew 25-35 tells us, I was a stranger and you invited me in. The question before us is not whether this young man deserves our help, but whether we deserve to call ourselves followers of Christ if we turn away from obvious suffering. Mrs. Hawthorne's face flushed an alarming shade of red as she found herself outnumbered by voices of reason and compassion. Reverend Stone, surely you're not suggesting we turn our town into some sort of refuge for every wandering Indian in the territory. There are practical considerations, financial considerations, safety considerations that cannot be ignored simply because of religious sentiment. What I'm suggesting, Reverend Stone replied with the gentle firmness of a man accustomed to counseling troubled souls, is that our response to the situation will say more about our character as a community than any sermon I might deliver from the pulpit. We have an opportunity to demonstrate the love of Christ in practical terms, or we can choose fear and prejudice. The choice is ours. Sheriff Crenshaw studied the faces of the gathered townspeople, reading the mixture of opinions and emotions that played across their features. Well, folks, seems like we've got ourselves a democratic situation here. Show of hands, who thinks the boy should be allowed to stay in town, at least until he's recovered his strength and had a chance to find work or move on? Hands rose. Slowly, Dr. Hartwell shot up immediately, followed by Murphy's thick fist. Timothy Fletcher raised his hand despite a warning look from his master at the forge. Reverend Stone nodded and lifted his hand with quiet dignity. Sarah Chen, after a moment's hesitation, raised hers as well, her expression determined despite the potential cost to her own precarious position in the community. And who thinks the boy should be moved along for the good of the community? Crenshaw continued, his voice remaining carefully neutral despite his obvious personal opinion. The Hawthorns' hands rose in unison, followed by a handful of other prosperous townspeople, who valued order and conformity above compassion. The count was close, closer than anyone had expected, revealing a community more divided in its prejudices than many had realized. Before Sheriff Crenshaw could announce the results of this impromptu vote, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the main street. A lone rider approached from the direction of the territorial road, his horse moving at an easy pace that suggested a man comfortable with both his mount and his place in the world. The horse was a magnificent black stallion, obviously well-bred and well cared for, while the rider himself sat straight in the saddle with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Augustus Gus Stillridge had not been seen in Bronco Springs for more than 3 months, not since the territorial governor's visit that had brought half the territory's wealthiest ranchers to town for a week of politics and planning. Owner of the largest cattle operation within 500 miles, Steel Ridge commanded respect that bordered on reverence in a territory where beef meant prosperity and prosperity meant power. His very presence could settle disputes, influence elections, and change the fortunes of entire communities. As the richest man in 3 territories approached, the crowd gathered around Daniel's sleeping form. Conversations died away to whispers, then to complete silence. Every person present understood that whatever Augustus Steelridge decided about this situation would carry more weight than all their Democratic voting combined. A reality that spoke to the harsh truths of power in the American frontier. Augustus Gus Steelridge dismounted from his black stallion with the practiced grace of a man who had spent more hours in the saddle than most people spent sleeping. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from building an empire with his own hands, weathering droughts that killed other men's dreams, and surviving frontier justice when law was nothing more than what a fast gun could impose. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed despite 3 days on the trail, and his dark eyes missed nothing as they swept across the crowd of townspeople gathered around the Cherokee boy. The silence that greeted Steelridge's arrival was profound, the kind of hush that falls when power enters a room full of lesser mortals. Even Mrs. Hawthorne, so vocal in her condemnation moments before, found herself smoothing her skirts and adopting a more demure posture. Herbert Hawthorne removed his hat entirely, clutching it against his chest like a shield. Sheriff Crenshaw straightened almost imperceptibly, the automatic response of a man who understood the delicate balance between official authority and economic reality. Steelridge's gaze lingered on Daniel's motionless form for a long moment before moving to each face in the crowd. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of absolute confidence and the subtle accent of someone born in Tennessee before making his fortune in Texas. "Morning, folks. Seems I've arrived in the middle of something interesting. Sheriff Crenshaw, mind filling me in on what's got everyone so stirred up this early in the day?" Crenshaw cleared his throat, acutely aware that his next words would be measured against not just the law, but against the economic interests of the man who employed half the territory through his various enterprises. "Mr. Steelridge, we've been discussing what to do about this young Cherokee fellow who's been sleeping rough outside Murphy's place for the past week. Some folks think he should move on, others believe he should be allowed to stay. We were just taking a vote when you rode up." "A vote," Steelridge repeated, his tone neutral, but somehow carrying an undertone of amusement. "Democracy in action, I suppose. And what exactly is this boy accused of doing wrong? Robbery? Assault? Disturbing the peace? Public drunkenness?" Mrs. Hawthorne stepped forward, her earlier confidence returning in the presence of someone whose wealth and influence far exceeded her husband's modest banking position. "Mr. Steelridge, surely you understand the importance of maintaining proper standards in our community. The boy's presence is unseemly. It reflects poorly on our town's character and could discourage quality settlers from making Bronco Springs their home." Steelridge's attention shifted to Murphy, who was watching the proceedings with barely concealed skepticism. "Murphy, you've had a front row seat to this situation. What's your take on things? This boy causing you problems with your customers?" Murphy's Irish accent thickened with emotion as he shook his head emphatically. "Not a bit of trouble. Mr. Steelridge, boy's quiet as a grave, polite when spoken to, keeps to himself completely. Never asked me for so much as a cup of water, though God knows he needs it. Been watching him for a week now, and I've seen more Christian charity in that kid's behavior than in half the folks who claim to follow the good book." Dr. Hartwell seized the opportunity to present her medical assessment to someone whose opinion carried real weight in the community. "Mr. Steelridge, from a health standpoint, that boy is in serious condition. Malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from exposure. He needs immediate care, not relocation. In my professional opinion, forcing him to move on in his current state would be unconscionable, Steelridge nodded thoughtfully, his weathered hands resting easily on his gun belt as he processed the conflicting information. His reputation for fair dealing was legendary throughout the territory, but so was his intolerance for anything that threatened his business interests or the stability of the communities where he operated. How long has he been in this condition? Doctor? At least a week, possibly longer based on his physical deterioration, Dr. Hartwell replied with clinical precision. Mr. Steelridge, I've treated men who've been lost in the desert for days, and this boy shows similar signs of prolonged deprivation. Whatever brought him to our town, he's been traveling hard and eating little for some time. Steelridge's keen business mind was already calculating the implications of the situation beyond the immediate. Humanitarian concerns. Bronco Springs served as a crucial supply depot for his vast ranching operations, and the town's reputation affected his ability to attract reliable workers and maintain good relationships with territorial authorities. Every decision made here would ripple outward through the complex web of frontier economics and politics. Timothy, Steelridge called to the young blacksmith's apprentice, who had been standing silent since casting his vote in favor of helping. Daniel, you've got sharp eyes and an honest tongue. Tell me what you've observed about this boy over the past week. Nothing fancy, just what you've seen with your own eyes. Timothy flushed with the honor of being addressed directly by the territory's most powerful man, but his voice remained steady as he answered. Mr. Steelridge, I come to work before dawn every day, and I see him when I open the forge. He don't move much during the day, but I've watched him share his water with stray dogs when he thought nobody was looking. Yesterday, when little Mary Kellerman dropped her doll in the street, he picked it up and handed it back to her without saying a word. Don't seem like the actions of somebody dangerous. The crowd stirred at this revelation, many hearing for the first time about Daniel's small acts of kindness that had gone unnoticed by adults focused on their own concerns. Sarah Chun nodded in recognition, remembering her own observations of the boy's gentle behavior toward the town's animals and children. Steelridge walked closer to Daniel's sleeping form, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. At this distance, the boy's extreme youth was even more apparent, his face gaunt with hunger, but retaining the softness that marked him as barely beyond childhood. The rancher's expression remained unreadable as he studied the threadbare blanket, the careful way Daniel had positioned himself to take up minimal space, the obvious pride that kept him from sprawling in defeat despite his desperate circumstances. Boy! Steelridge called softly, his voice carrying just enough authority to penetrate Daniel's consciousness without startling him. Son, I'd like a word with you. Daniel's eyes opened slowly, the wariness of someone accustomed to expecting the worst from every human encounter. He sat up carefully, his movements revealing the stiffness of a week spent sleeping on hard ground. When his gaze met Steelridge's, there was no defiance, but neither was there submission. Instead, there was a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had faced adversity without surrendering his essential self. Yes, sir, Daniel said, his voice hoarse from disuse but clear in its respect. He made no attempt to stand, perhaps recognizing that sudden movements might be interpreted as threatening by the assembled crowd. Steelridge crouched down, bringing himself to Daniel's eye level in a gesture that surprised everyone present. The richest man in 3 territories, whose word could make or break entire communities, was treating a homeless Cherokee boy as an equal worthy of respectful conversation. What's your name, son? Daniel Fireheart, sir, came the quiet reply. Of the Cherokee Nation. And what brings you to Bronco Springs, Daniel Fireheart? Steelridge's tone remained conversational, but his businessman's instincts were evaluating every nuance of the boy's responses. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing the carefully folded piece of paper. That had obviously been handled many times. I have a letter, sir, from the territorial governor's office. It promised work at the railroad depot, but when I arrived, they said the position was filled. Steelridge accepted the letter and unfolded it with gentle care, his eyes scanning the official letterhead in formal language. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, as he recognized the standard form letter used to placate Native American job seekers while never intending to honor the promises contained within. The document was legitimate, bearing the governor's seal and signature, but Steelridge knew from his own dealings with territorial officials that such letters were issued freely with no expectation of follow-through. "This is a valid employment authorization," Steelridge announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "Signed by Governor Martinez himself, promising railroad work to qualified applicants." "Daniel, do you have experience with railroad construction?" Daniel nodded eagerly, the first sign of hope anyone had seen from him in days. "Yes, sir. I worked on the Denver and Rio Grande line for 6 months last year. I can lay track, operate hand tools, work with explosives if needed. I have references from the foreman, if they'd be willing to write them." The crowd exchanged glances, many beginning to see Daniel not as a vagrant to be removed, but as a skilled worker who had been systematically denied opportunities based solely on his race. Even Herbert Hawthorne looked uncomfortable as the implications of the situation became clear. Steelridge stood, still holding the employment letter. "Sheriff, I believe we have a case of discrimination here. This boy came to Bronco Springs on the promise of legitimate work, only to be turned away despite having proper authorization and relevant experience. That's not just morally wrong, it's a violation of territorial employment law." Mrs. Hawthorne's voice rose in protest, though. She seemed less certain than before. "Mr. Steelridge, surely you're not suggesting that our railroad depot should be required to hire every person who appears with a letter. There are standards to maintain, qualifications to consider." "What I'm suggesting," Steelridge replied, with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "is that territorial law requires employers to give fair consideration to all qualified applicants, regardless of race or tribal affiliation. Governor Martinez made that very clear at our last territorial meeting. Anyone operating in violation of those guidelines risks losing their territorial contracts." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Steelridge's business empire included significant territorial contracts for cattle supplies, transportation services, and land management. His influence with Governor Martinez was well known, and his displeasure could result in serious consequences for anyone operating outside territorial law. Reverend Stone stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning sun. "Mr. Steelridge, from a Christian perspective, surely we have an obligation to assist this young man, regardless of the legal technicalities. He's hungry, homeless, and in need of basic human compassion." Steelridge nodded approvingly at the Reverend's words. "You're absolutely right, Reverend. Legal obligations aside, we have a moral duty to help anyone in genuine need." "Daniel, how long since you've had a proper meal?" Daniel's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but he answered honestly. 3 days, sir. I had some hardtack and water, but it ran out Tuesday morning." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Even Mrs. Hawthorne looked uncomfortable at the thought of a 16-year-old boy surviving without food for 3 days, while the entire town debated his right to exist in their midst. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward with professional urgency. "Mr. Steelridge, the boy needs immediate medical attention and nutrition. 3 days without food, combined with his previous malnourished state, could result in serious health complications if not addressed quickly." Steelridge made his decision with the swift certainty that had made him successful in business and respected throughout the territory. "Murphy, can your kitchen prepare a meal suitable for someone in Daniel's condition? Nothing too heavy at first, but something nutritious and warming." Murphy's face broke into the first genuine smile the morning had produced. "Aye, Mr. Steelridge. We've got soup simmering, fresh bread from this morning's baking, and tea that'll warm him from the inside out." Be my pleasure to see the lad properly fed. Excellent. Daniel, when did you last sleep at a real bed? Daniel's eyes widened at the unexpected question. Not since I left the Cherokee Nation, sir. That was 6 weeks ago. Steelridge turned to face the crowd. His decision clearly made despite whatever opposition might arise. Folks, here's what we're going to do. Daniel Fireheart is going to be my guest while we sort out this employment situation. He'll stay at my ranch until we can arrange proper work and housing here in town. Anyone who has a problem with that arrangement can discuss it with me personally. The silence that followed was absolute. Augustus Steelridge had just announced his intention to take a homeless Cherokee boy into his own home, despite the social conventions and racial prejudices that dominated frontier society. The implications were staggering, not just for Daniel, but for the entire community's understanding of how power and privilege could be used. Mrs. Hawthorne found her voice first, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. Mr. Steelridge, surely you're not serious. The social implications, the precedent this would set, ... What will people say? Steelridge's smile was razor sharp, the expression of a man who had faced down rustlers, outlaws, and crooked politicians without flinching. Mrs. Hawthorne, I've spent 30 years building a reputation based on fair dealing and honest work. Any man or woman who questions my judgment in this matter is welcome to state their objections publicly. I promise you'll find me very willing to discuss the issue in detail. The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that no one present doubted Steelridge's willingness to follow through. His wealth and influence could destroy careers, ruin businesses, and drive families from the territory if he chose to exercise his full power. Daniel struggled to his feet, swaying slightly from weakness but managing to stand straight. Mr. Steelridge, sir, I don't want to cause trouble for you or anyone else. I can move on, find work somewhere else. I don't want charity. Steelridge studied the boy's face, seeing the pride that refused to bend even in the face of desperate need. Daniel, this isn't charity, this is business. I'm always looking for good workers, and it sounds like you have skills I can use. Consider this a job interview with room and board included while we work out the details. The crowd began to disperse as people realized the show was over. Steelridge had spoken, and in Bronco Springs, that was as final as a judge's gavel. Some left shaking their heads in disapproval, others nodding in grudging respect for a man willing to back his principles with action, as Daniel gathered his few possessions. Steelridge noticed the careful way the boy folded his thin blanket, the reverent handling of what was obviously a treasured possession. That blanket has seen some miles, he observed. Daniel's fingers traced the worn fabric with obvious affection. It was my grandmother's, sir. She made it when I was born, said it would keep me safe on long journeys. I suppose she was right. It's brought me this far. For the first time that morning, Augustus Steelridge's carefully controlled expression softened, revealing a glimpse of the man behind the legend. Son, something tells me your grandmother would be proud of how you've conducted yourself here. Takes courage to maintain dignity when the whole world seems set against you. The ride to Steel Ridge Ranch took them through 20 miles of Texas territory that spoke eloquently of wealth built through vision and relentless determination. Daniel sat behind Augustus Steelridge on the Black Stallion, his weakened state making the journey feel like traveling through a fever dream of endless grassland dotted with countless cattle, bearing the distinctive Caesar brand. The scope of Steelridge's empire became apparent with each mile, from the network of windmills pumping precious water to the surface, to the carefully maintained fence lines that stretched beyond the horizon. The ranch house itself rose from the prairie like a monument to frontier success, 3 stories of solid timber and native stone that could house 20 men comfortably. Unlike the crude structures that passed for homes in most of the territory, Steelridge's dwelling boasted glass windows, painted shutters, and a wraparound porch that spoke of Eastern refinement adapted to Western practicality. Corrals, barns, and outbuildings spread around the main house in organized efficiency, while a dozen cowboys moved about their daily tasks with the unhurried competence of men who knew their work and took pride in doing it well. As they approached the front porch, a woman emerged from the house, her appearance immediately commanding Daniel's respectful attention. Maria Consuela Steelridge stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the space around her with the authority of someone accustomed to managing both household and business affairs. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. Her dress was practical cotton rather than fashionable silk, but it was perfectly tailored and spotlessly clean, despite the dust that seemed to coat everything else in the territory. "Gus," she called, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent that spoke of California origins. "You said you were going to town for supplies, not collecting strays." Her tone held no real criticism, only the gentle teasing of a woman secure in her relationship with a powerful man. Steelridge dismounted and helped Daniel down with careful attention to the boy's obvious weakness. "Maria, I'd like you to meet Daniel Fireheart. He's going to be staying with us while we sort out some employment difficulties in town. Daniel, this is my wife, Mrs. Steelridge, who runs this ranch far better than I ever could." Maria's sharp eyes took in Daniel's condition with the swift assessment of someone experienced in frontier medicine. His hollow cheeks, the way he swayed slightly on his feet, the careful manner in which he held himself all spoke to her of someone pushed far beyond normal endurance. "When did you last eat, young man?" "Murphy fed him some soup before we left town," Steelridge answered when Daniel hesitated. "But he told me it's been 3 days since his last real meal. Dr. Hartwell thinks he's been traveling hard for weeks with insufficient food." Maria's expression shifted from curiosity to maternal concern in the space of a heartbeat. 3 days? Dios mío, bring him inside immediately. Carlos. She called to a weathered cowhand near the barn. "Have Rosa prepare the guest room on the ground floor and tell her to set up a bath. This boy needs immediate attention." Daniel found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I don't want to impose. Mr. Steelridge said this was about work, not charity. I can sleep in the bunkhouse with the other hands." Maria's laugh was warm but firm, the sound of a woman who had successfully argued with territorial governors and cattle buyers without losing an ounce of feminine grace. "Nonsense. You'll stay in the main house where I can keep an eye on your recovery. Any friend of my husband's is a guest in our home, and guests don't sleep with the ranch hands, no matter how respectable those men might be." As they entered the house, Daniel's eyes widened at the unexpected luxury surrounding him. Polished wooden floors stretched across, spacious rooms filled with furniture that had obviously been shipped at great expense from Eastern manufacturers. Books lined the walls of what appeared to be a library, while oil paintings depicted pastoral scenes that seemed impossibly green compared to the harsh beauty of the Texas landscape. Most surprising of all was the presence of modern conveniences: gas lamps instead of candles, a grandfather clock that chimed with Swiss precision, and rugs that had clearly never known the rough treatment typical of frontier homes. "Your first priority is a bath and a proper meal," Maria announced, her tone brooking no argument. "Rosa will find you clean clothes that fit, and Dr. Steelridge will examine you to ensure you haven't developed any serious conditions from your travels." Daniel stopped walking, confusion evident on his gaunt features. "Dr. Steelridge." "Ma'am," Steelridge chuckled at the boy's surprise. "My wife graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania before we met. She's the finest doctor in 3 territories, though she gave up formal practice when we married. Now she mainly treats ranch hands, difficult births, and stubborn husbands who refuse to admit they're sick." The revelation that he was in the home of not just the territory's wealthiest rancher, but also one of its most qualified physicians, left Daniel speechless. The combination of power, wealth, education, and compassion represented by this unlikely couple challenged every assumption he had formed about frontier society. Rosa Mendoza appeared as if summoned by magic, a plump woman in her 50s whose kind eyes and flour-dusted apron marked her as the ranch cook. She looked Daniel up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had fed countless hungry men, her expression softening as she recognized the signs of genuine starvation. Pobrecito, you are nothing but skin and bones. Come, we fix this right away. The bath was a luxury Daniel had almost forgotten existed. Hot water, actual soap that smelled of lavender rather than harsh lye, and clean towels that had been warmed by the kitchen fire transformed the simple act of washing into something approaching religious experience. When he finally emerged, dressed in clothes that Rosa had somehow altered to fit his thin frame, he felt more human than he had in months. The dining room table had been set with enough food to feed a small army. Rosa had prepared beef stew, rich with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, roasted chicken with herbs, and apple pie that filled the room with the scent of cinnamon and home. Daniel's stomach cramped with anticipation, but years of hunger had taught him to approach abundance with caution. Start slowly, Maria advised, settling beside him with a medical bag that she opened to reveal instruments as fine as any found in big city hospitals. Your stomach needs time to readjust to regular food. Too much too fast will make you sick. As Daniel ate with careful restraint, Maria conducted a thorough examination that revealed the full extent of his recent hardships. Healed cuts on his hands spoke of manual labor, while calluses told the story of someone unafraid of hard work. His feet showed the damage of long-distance walking in inadequate boots, and his overall muscle tone suggested someone naturally strong who had been worn down by circumstance rather than laziness. How long have you been traveling alone? Maria asked as she checked his reflexes with professional competence. Daniel swallowed a small spoonful of stew before answering. 6 weeks, ma'am. I left Cherokee Nation in early September. Been working my way south looking for railroad jobs. Had some success in Colorado, but the work ended when winter set in. Steelridge leaned back in his chair, his businessman's mind already working through the implications of Daniel's story. What made you leave the Cherokee Nation? Family troubles? Legal problems? Pain flickered across Daniel's features before he could control his expression. My grandmother passed last spring, sir. She raised me after my parents died of fever. When I was 8. Before she died, she made me promise to leave the reservation, to find a place where I could build something better than what the government was offering our people. The simple statement carried depths of loss and determination that filled the elegant dining room with sudden gravity. Maria's medical examination paused as she absorbed the full weight of what Daniel had shared, while Steelridge's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the courage required for a 16-year-old boy to leave everything familiar in pursuit of an uncertain future. She wanted me to prove that Cherokee blood could succeed in the white man's world, Daniel continued, his voice barely audible. Said I had to show that we were more than what the newspapers claimed, more than the stereotypes people believed. But everywhere I go, I find the same walls, the same assumptions about what someone like me can accomplish. Rosa, who had been bustling about the kitchen, paused in her work to listen. Her own experience as a Mexican woman in Texas territory had taught her about the invisible barriers that could make success nearly impossible for anyone whose heritage marked them as different. Steelridge stood and walked to the window overlooking his vast holdings, his mind clearly working through possibilities that only a man of his resources could contemplate. Daniel, what would you say if I told you I've been looking for someone with exactly your qualifications for a position that could change your entire future? Daniel set down his spoon, hardly daring to hope. I'd say I'm listening, sir. I'm expanding my operations to include a railroad spur that will connect my ranch directly to the main line. It's a massive undertaking that requires someone With both railroad experience and the intelligence to learn the business side of transportation logistics. The position would start with hands-on construction work, but the right person could advance to management responsibilities within a year. The opportunity was so far beyond Daniel's expectations that he struggled to find words. "Mr. Steelridge, I appreciate your kindness, but I have to ask why you'd offer such a chance to someone you just met. People don't usually take risks on Cherokee boys with no references and no permanent address." Maria answered before her husband could speak, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature from both sides of the racial divide. "Daniel, my husband didn't build this empire by being charitable to undeserving people. He's offering you this opportunity because he recognizes potential when he sees it, and because he believes talent should be rewarded regardless of where it comes from." Steelridge nodded in agreement. "My grandfather came to this country from Scotland with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. He faced discrimination for his accent, his religion, and his foreign ways. But he found people willing to judge him by his actions rather than his origins. And that made all the difference." As evening approached, the three of them sat on the front porch, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel's strength was already returning thanks to proper food and rest, while his mind raced with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The silence between them was comfortable, the easy quiet of people who had found unexpected common ground. "There's something you should understand about what happened in town today," Steelridge said eventually, his voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "Taking you under my protection wasn't just about helping one person. It was about sending a message to the entire territory about what kind of community we're building here." Daniel turned to face his host, sensing the importance of what was being shared. "What kind of message, sir?" "That success in this territory will be based on merit, not on the accident of birth or the color of someone's skin. That we're going to build something better than the prejudices we left behind in other places. But understand, Daniel, that message is going to create enemies as well as allies." Maria reached over to squeeze her husband's hand, a gesture that spoke of shared convictions and mutual support in the face of potential opposition. "There will be people who see your success as a threat to their own position, who believe that helping you somehow diminishes their own worth. We need you to be prepared for that reality." Daniel absorbed this warning with the gravity it deserved, understanding that accepting Steelridge's offer meant more than just securing employment. It meant becoming a symbol in a larger struggle over the future direction of frontier society. "I understand the risks," he said finally. "My grandmother always taught me that the easiest path isn't always the right path. She said that sometimes you have to be willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." "Especially when it's dangerous," Steelridge smiled with genuine approval. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. I think she would have approved of what we're trying to accomplish here." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Rosa emerged from the house carrying a tray with coffee and fresh apple turnovers. "Senator Daniel," she said with motherly authority, "tomorrow you start getting strong again. Tonight, you sleep in a real bed with a full stomach and clean clothes. Manana, we begin building your future." The warmth of acceptance, the promise of meaningful work, and the unexpected discovery of people who judged character over ancestry combined to create a sense of hope that Daniel had thought lost forever. For the first time since leaving Cherokee Nation, he could envision a future that honored his grandmother's faith in his potential. "There's one more thing," Steelridge added as they prepared to retire for the evening. "Tomorrow we're going back to town. I want you to walk down that Main Street with your head high, wearing clothes that mark you as my employee and my guest. Some people need to see that their prejudices have consequences, and others need to understand that change is coming whether they like it or not." Daniel's pulse quickened at the thought of returning to Bronco Springs so soon, but he recognized the wisdom in Steelridge's approach. Hiding at the ranch would solve nothing, while a public display of his new status would establish his position in the community's social hierarchy. As they said their goodnights and Daniel made his way to the guest room that had been prepared for him, he paused at the window overlooking the vast expanse of Steel Ridge property. Somewhere out there in the darkness grazed thousands of cattle that represented security, prosperity, and the kind of success his grandmother had dreamed he might achieve. The bed was softer than anything he had known since childhood, the sheets clean and smooth against skin that had grown accustomed to rough ground and threadbare blankets. As sleep finally claimed him, Daniel's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude to his grandmother's spirit and a promise that he would prove worthy of the unprecedented opportunity that had been placed before him. The next morning brought news that would test every alliance Daniel had formed in his brief time at Steel Ridge Ranch. Carlos Mendoza, the ranch foreman, rode in before dawn with information that caused Augustus Steelridge's jaw to tighten in a way that his cowboys had learned to recognize as the calm before a dangerous storm. Judge Harrison Blackwood, the territorial circuit judge and political rival whose influence rivaled Steelridge's own, had arrived in Bronco Springs during the night with a federal marshal and a stack of legal documents that threatened to unravel everything. "He's claiming Daniel's presence violates the Indian Removal Act," Carlos reported, his weathered face grim with concern. "Says harboring a Cherokee boy outside reservation boundaries constitutes interference with federal Indian policy." The marshals got papers authorizing Daniel's immediate arrest and transport back to Cherokee Nation. Daniel, who had been enjoying his first proper breakfast in months, felt his stomach drop as if he'd been kicked by a horse. The federal government's power to relocate Native Americans at will was absolute, and no amount of wealth or influence could stand against Washington's determination to maintain racial boundaries through legal force. Maria set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her physician's training evident in the way she remained calm while processing devastating news. "Gus, you know Blackwood's been looking for an excuse to challenge your authority in this territory ever since you opposed his railroad development scheme. This isn't about federal law, it's about political revenge." Steelridge's reputation had been built on his ability to outmaneuver opponents through a combination of economic pressure and strategic thinking. But federal law presented challenges that even his vast resources could not easily overcome. Judge Blackwood commanded respect throughout the territory, his legal expertise and federal connections making him a formidable adversary who understood exactly how to use governmental authority as a weapon. "What are our options?" Steel Ridge asked Carlos, his mind already working through possibilities that most men would never consider. "How much time do we have before they move to execute those papers?" "Blackwood's calling a hearing for this afternoon," Carlos replied. "Claims he wants to give you a chance to surrender Daniel voluntarily before ordering his arrest. But everyone in town knows this is really about forcing you to back down publicly to show that your influence has limits." Daniel pushed his plate away, his appetite destroyed by the realization that his brief taste of hope might already be ending. "Mr. Steelridge, I won't let you risk your position for me. I can disappear before the hearing. Head north toward Colorado, where the railroad work is starting up again." The suggestion brought immediate protests from both Steelridge and Maria, their rejection of retreat revealing the depth of their commitment to the principles they had chosen to defend. This was no longer just about helping one Cherokee boy. It had become a test of whether justice could prevail over prejudice in a territory still defining its character. Running would accomplish nothing except to validate Blackwood's accusations. Maria pointed out with clinical precision, "You'd spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, and we'd have surrendered the moral authority we've worked years to establish in this community." Steelridge stood and walked to the window, his eyes scanning the vast holdings that represented 30 years of backbreaking work and strategic planning. Everything he had built could potentially be threatened by this confrontation, but his Scottish grandfather's voice seemed to whisper across the decades, reminding him that some fights were worth the risk. Carlos, send word to town that we'll attend Judge Blackwood's hearing. Steelridge decided, his voice carrying the finality of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But we won't be going defenseless. I want you to ride to Austin immediately and telegram my attorney there. Tell him to research every precedent involving territorial jurisdiction over federal Indian policy. As Carlos departed on his urgent mission, the morning transformed into a frantic preparation for legal battle. Maria disappeared into her study, emerging with law books and territorial statutes that she had acquired during her medical training. Daniel found himself caught between admiration for their determination and guilt over the chaos his presence had created in their orderly lives. The ride into Bronco Springs felt like a funeral procession, with word of the impending hearing having spread throughout the territory overnight. Cowboys from neighboring ranches lined the road, their presence serving as both show of support for Steelridge and reminder of the economic power he wielded. But for every friendly face, Daniel spotted others whose expressions revealed satisfaction at seeing the territory's most influential man finally challenged by authority he could not buy or intimidate. Main Street had been transformed into an outdoor courtroom, with Judge Blackwood holding court from the steps of the town hall, while Federal Marshal Thompson stood beside him in full uniform. Blackwood himself was an imposing figure, tall and lean, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness in those who stood before him. His black judicial robes fluttered in the afternoon breeze, lending him an air of biblical authority that was clearly calculated to intimidate. The crowd that had gathered included representatives from every segment of territorial society. Wealthy ranchers stood alongside shopkeepers and laborers, while representatives from various Native American tribes watched from the periphery, understanding that the outcome of this hearing would affect their own tenuous relationships with white communities throughout the region. Augustus Steelridge, Judge Blackwood called, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. You stand accused of harboring a Cherokee individual in violation of federal law. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 clearly establishes that members of relocated tribes must remain within designated reservation boundaries unless specifically authorized by federal authorities. Steelridge stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had faced down cattle rustlers, corrupt politicians, and natural disasters without losing his composure. Your Honor, I believe you'll find that the Indian Removal Act specifically addresses tribal communities, not individuals seeking lawful employment in territories open to all qualified workers. The legal argument drew murmurs from the crowd, many of whom had never considered the distinction between tribal jurisdiction and individual rights. Daniel watched in fascination as two of the territory's most powerful men prepared for intellectual combat that would determine his fate. Judge Blackwood's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Mr. Steelridge, surely you're not suggesting that federal Indian policy can be circumvented simply by claiming individual rather than tribal status. The Cherokee Nation signed treaties that specifically address the movement of their people beyond reservation boundaries. Maria stepped forward, her medical bag replaced by a leather satchel containing legal documents that Carlos had retrieved from Austin. Your Honor, if I may, we have territorial precedents that establish the right of Native Americans to seek employment outside reservation boundaries when such work does not conflict with treaty obligations. The unexpected intervention of a Pavot woman in what was traditionally a male-dominated legal proceeding caused a stir among the assembled crowd. Judge Blackwood's expression revealed his irritation at having his authority challenged by someone he clearly considered an inferior. Mrs. Steelridge, while I appreciate your enthusiasm for legal research, this hearing concerns federal law that supersedes any territorial precedents you may have discovered. Blackwood replied with condescending politeness that barely concealed his contempt. Daniel had remained silent throughout the proceedings, But the dismissive treatment of Maria finally pushed him beyond his ability to remain passive. "Your Honor, may I speak on my own behalf?" The request brought absolute silence to the crowded street. Federal Marshal Thompson's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, while Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed with surprise and calculation. "Young man, you are the subject of these proceedings, not a participant in them." Blackwood replied with the tone of someone addressing the child rather than a person whose future hung in the balance. Daniel's grandmother had taught him that dignity could never be taken away, only surrendered, and he drew upon that lesson as he faced the most powerful legal authority in the territory. "Your Honor, I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, but I am also an individual with rights guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. I came to Bronco Springs seeking lawful employment, not to challenge federal authority or violate treaty obligations." The articulate response clearly surprised Judge Blackwood, who had expected to face either defiant hostility or submissive acceptance, rather than reasoned legal argument. The crowd stirred with interest as they witnessed a Cherokee teenager demonstrating knowledge of constitutional law that many of them could not match. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "the employment authorization I carry bears the signature of Governor Martinez, a federal appointee whose authority to grant such permissions cannot be questioned without challenging the territorial government itself." Judge Blackwood's face reddened as he realized that Daniel's argument had effectively trapped him between conflicting federal authorities. Ruling against the Cherokee boy would require him to declare that territorial governors lacked the authority to grant employment permissions, thereby undermining the entire system of territorial administration. Federal Marshal Thompson stepped forward, his uniform lending weight to his words as he addressed the crowd. "Judge Blackwood, I believe we need to consider the broader implications of this case. If we rule that territorial employment authorizations are invalid, we could create a legal precedent that undermines federal territorial policy throughout the region." The political calculation was clear to everyone present. Judge Blackwood had overreached in his attempt to humiliate Steelridge, creating a legal trap that threatened to damage his own authority if he pressed forward with his original intention. Mrs. Hawthorne, who had been watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction, finally found her voice. "Judge Blackwood, surely you're not going to allow legal technicalities to override the clear intent of federal Indian policy. The boy needs to be returned to his people where he belongs." Her intervention provided Judge Blackwood with an opportunity to retreat from his untenable position while maintaining the appearance of legal authority. Mrs. Hawthorne raises important points about the spirit of federal law versus its technical interpretation. However, given the complex jurisdictional questions raised by this case, I believe the matter requires further study. Steelridge recognized the judge's attempt to postpone defeat and moved quickly to press his advantage. "Your Honor, while you conduct that study, I trust that Daniel will be allowed to remain at my ranch under my supervision. As a territorial citizen and federal taxpayer, I guarantee his availability for any future legal proceedings." The crowd held its breath as Judge Blackwood weighed his options, clearly aware that any decision he made would have far-reaching political consequences. His rivalry with Steelridge was well known, but destroying his own legal credibility for the sake of personal revenge would be a Pyrrhic victory. "Very well," Judge Blackwood announced with obvious reluctance. "The boy may remain under Mr. Steelridge's supervision pending further review of the jurisdictional questions raised by this case. However, I want it clearly understood that this temporary arrangement does not constitute a precedent for future cases." As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension that left him emotionally drained. The Conde legal victory was temporary at best, and he understood that Judge Blackwood would use the delay to find new ways to challenge his right to remain in the territory. Sheriff Crenshaw approached Steelridge with the careful neutrality of a man caught between competing authorities. Mr. Steelridge, I hope you understand that this situation has created tensions that go beyond legal technicalities. There are folks in this territory who see Daniel's presence as a threat to their way of life. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were clear. Legal authority meant nothing if it could not be enforced, and the sheriff's ability to maintain order depended on community support that was clearly divided. As they prepared to return to the ranch, Daniel noticed groups of men engaged in intense conversations throughout the town. Some were clearly supporters of Steelridge's position, while others appeared to be organizing opposition that could take forms more dangerous than legal challenges. Dr. Hartwell approached Maria with medical concerns that transcended the political implications of the hearing. Mrs. Steelridge, I've been observing the crowd's reaction, and I'm worried about potential violence. There are elements in this territory who won't be satisfied with legal solutions if they don't like the outcome. The physician's warning proved prophetic as the Steelridge party prepared to leave town. A group of men led by Jake Morrison, a failed rancher whose bitterness toward Steelridge's success had festered for years, blocked their path with obvious hostile intent. Steelridge, Morrison called, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of someone with nothing left to lose. You may have fooled that judge with your legal tricks, but you ain't fooled us. That Cherokee boy's got no business in this territory, and neither do folks who put Indian welfare above their own neighbors. The confrontation drew immediate attention from the remaining townspeople, many of whom began choosing sides based on loyalties and prejudices that had been simmering beneath the surface of territorial society for years. Daniel found himself at the center of a conflict that threatened to tear the community apart. Steelridge's response would determine whether this dispute remained civilized or descended into the kind of violence that had plagued other frontier territories struggling to define their identity in an era of rapid social change. The standoff on Main Street stretched like a taut wire, with Jake Morrison's bitter faction blocking the path while Steelridge's supporters began forming their own defensive line behind the rancher's wagon. Daniel could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, some filled with hatred, others with curiosity, but all recognizing that this moment would define the future of race relations in the territory for years to come. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dusty street into a pressure cooker where long simmering resentments threatened to explode into violence. Morrison stepped closer, his unwashed clothes and bloodshot eyes marking him as a man whose failures had driven him to desperation and drink. Behind him stood a collection of similarly desperate men, former ranch hands who had been fired for incompetence, failed businessmen who blamed their losses on Steelridge's success, and drifters who saw opportunity in chaos. You think your money makes you better than the rest of us, Steelridge? Think you can change the natural order of things just because you got more cattle than sense? The accusation carried deeper implications than simple economic jealousy. Morrison was voicing the fears of men who saw their own marginal position in society threatened by any change that might elevate others above them. If a Cherokee boy could find success and acceptance, what did that say about their own failures and limitations? Behind Morrison, Cletus Wade, a former Steelridge employee who had been dismissed for stealing cattle, nodded vigorously, his scarred face twisted with years of accumulated resentment. Steelridge's voice remained calm, but Daniel noticed the subtle shift in posture that marked a man preparing for violence while hoping to avoid it. His hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to the Colt revolver holstered at his side, a movement that was mirrored by several of his loyal ranch hands who had accompanied them to town. Morrison, you're drunk and you're angry, but you're not stupid. Look around you. Count the men standing with you, then count the ones standing behind me. Think about what happens next if you choose to make this about force instead of reason. The mathematical reality was stark. Morrison's faction numbered perhaps 8 men, while Steelridge commanded the loyalty of more than 20 cowboys, plus the tacit support of most townspeople who depended on his business for their prosperity. But desperation had a way of making men overlook such practical considerations, and Morrison's bloodshot eyes held the dangerous gleam of someone with nothing left to lose. "Numbers don't mean everything," Wade called out, his voice slurred from an early start on the day's drinking. "Especially when some of those numbers are bought and paid for with dirty money. How many of your loyal hands you think will stick around when bullets start flying for the sake of one Indian boy?" The challenge struck at the heart of frontier loyalty, questioning whether economic relationships could withstand the test of genuine danger. Several of Steel Ridge's younger cowboys shifted uncomfortably, their commitment to their employer's principles untested by serious threat. Dr. Hartwell pushed through the crowd with medical authority that commanded respect even from hostile factions, her black medical bag clutched firmly in her hand as she prepared for the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. "Gentlemen, I have patients to attend and a town to keep healthy. This street corner posturing serves no one except those who profit from conflict. Mr. Morrison, your wife specifically asked me to remind you about your children's welfare if I saw you today." The mention of family responsibilities seemed to penetrate Morrison's alcohol-fueled rage, introducing a moment of uncertainty that revealed the man he might have been under different circumstances. His wife, Sarah Morrison, was known throughout the territory as a decent woman struggling to raise 3 young children while her husband descended into bitterness and drink. The reminder of his parental duties created visible conflict between his desire for revenge and his remaining shreds of conscience. Sheriff Crenshaw immediately exploited the moment of uncertainty, his lawman's instincts recognizing the narrow window of opportunity to defuse the situation before it escalated beyond control. "Jake, you know I can't let this escalate into street fighting. Take your grievances to the proper authorities. Follow legal channels. Don't force me to arrest you in front of your neighbors and your children." The sheriff's words carried additional weight because everyone present knew that Crenshaw had children of his own, and his commitment to maintaining law and order stemmed from personal understanding of what community violence could cost innocent families. His steady gaze encompassed both factions, making it clear that he would enforce peace regardless of his personal sympathies. But before Morrison could respond, a new voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Stand aside, all of you." Judge Blackwood approached from the direction of the town hall, his black robes lending him an air of ultimate authority that temporarily froze both factions in place. His earlier legal defeat had clearly not diminished his determination to influence the outcome of this confrontation. The judge's intervention carried implications that went beyond simple peacekeeping. His legal defeat in the hearing had been public and humiliating, and everyone present understood that he might be seeking alternative means to achieve his objectives. The combination of wounded pride and frustrated ambition made him potentially more dangerous than Morrison's drunken faction. "Mr. Morrison," Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the measured tones of judicial authority that had intimidated countless defendants over the years, "while I sympathize with your concerns about the precedent being set here, vigilante action serves no one's interests. The law provides proper channels for addressing grievances against federal policy, channels that I am uniquely qualified to navigate." The subtle offer of alliance was not lost on Morrison or his supporters, who recognized that Judge Blackwood's legal expertise and federal connections could provide them with weapons far more powerful than the crude physical intimidation they had been contemplating. The possibility of legitimate opposition through official channels offered a more attractive alternative to street violence. Morrison's face twisted with frustration as he found himself caught between competing authorities, each offering different paths toward the same goal of removing Daniel from the territory. "Judge, with all due respect, the law ain't protecting us from what's happening here. That Cherokee boy represents everything that's wrong with how this territory's being run. We got rights too, rights that are being trampled by folks who think money can buy them special treatment." The complaint revealed the depth of economic anxiety that fueled much of the opposition to Daniel's presence. Morrison and his supporters saw themselves as victims of forces beyond their control, marginalized by economic changes that favored educated, skilled workers over those who relied solely on physical labor and racial privilege. Daniel felt compelled to speak, despite the danger of drawing more attention to himself in an already volatile situation. His grandmother had taught him that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of defeat, regardless of the personal cost of speaking truth. "Mr. Morrison, I never asked for special treatment. I came here looking for honest work, nothing more. I'm not trying to take anything away from you or your family." The calm dignity of Daniel's response seemed to inflame Morrison's anger rather than diffuse it, revealing how deeply threatened he felt by any demonstration of Cherokee intelligence or reasonableness. The very fact that Daniel could speak eloquently challenged Morrison's fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and his own place in the social order. "You hear that?" Morrison called to his supporters, his voice rising to a pitch that carried clearly across the assembled crowd. "The savage thinks he can reason with us, thinks he's our equal just because Steelridge gave him some fancy clothes and taught him to talk pretty. This is exactly what I'm talking about. They come and acting humble, then before you know it, they're taking jobs that should go to white men, marrying white women, and telling us how to run our own communities." The progression of fears that Morrison articulated reflected common anxieties about racial integration that extended far beyond employment concerns. His supporters nodded vigorously, recognizing their own unspoken terrors in his public denunciation of social change. Maria Steelridge had been listening to the exchange with growing impatience, her medical training making her acutely aware of how quickly mob psychology could turn deadly, especially when fueled by alcohol and economic desperation. Her experience treating victims of frontier violence had taught her to recognize the warning signs that preceded bloodshed. "Mr. Morrison," she interjected with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations, "you speak of jobs going to white men, but when was the last time you actually applied for honest work? Daniel has railroad experience and skills that most of your supporters lack. Perhaps if you spent as much energy seeking employment as you do seeking scapegoats, your family's circumstances might improve." The challenge struck home with devastating accuracy, exposing the hypocrisy in Morrison's complaints about unfair competition. His employment history was well known throughout the territory. A series of failed opportunities and burned bridges that had more to do with his drinking and unreliability than with any ethnic competition. Several townspeople exchanged knowing glances, remembering specific instances of Morrison's professional failures. Sensing the mood of his followers beginning to waver under the weight of inconvenient facts, Morrison played his final card, appealing to fears that transcended individual economic concerns. "This ain't just about jobs or individual rights. It's about what kind of community we're building here, what kind of future we're creating for our children. You let one Indian stay, pretty soon you'll have whole tribes moving in, claiming the same rights as civilized folks. Where does it end? Do we wait until they outnumber us? Until they're making decisions about our laws, our schools, our churches?" The fear-mongering struck a responsive chord among some of the assembled townspeople, revealing the depth of racial anxiety that lay beneath the surface of frontier society. Even some of Steelridge's supporters shifted uncomfortably, indicating that Morrison's message resonated more widely than anyone wanted to admit. The specter of demographic change and loss of white control tapped into primal fears that rational arguments struggled to address. Reverend Stone chose this moment to assert moral authority over the proceedings, his tall frame and clerical collar commanding attention as he moved to the center of the conflict with the deliberate pace of someone confident in his spiritual authority. "Brothers and sisters, we stand at a crossroads that will define our community's character for generations to come. Are we Christians who practice love and acceptance, Or are we hypocrites who mouth scripture while harboring hatred in our hearts? The religious appeal introduced a new dimension to the conflict, forcing people to consider their actions in terms of eternal consequences rather than temporary fears. Mrs. Hawthorne found herself caught between her social prejudices and her public devotion to Christian principles, her face reflecting the internal struggle between competing value systems. "Reverend," she said carefully, her voice revealing the strain of attempting to reconcile contradictory impulses. "Surely you're not suggesting that Christian charity requires us to abandon all standards and boundaries. There are proper ways to help those in need without disrupting the social order that God has established. Even the Bible speaks of different peoples having their appointed places." The theological debate that ensued revealed the complex ways in which religious belief could be used to justify both inclusion and exclusion, with Scripture being interpreted through the lens of existing prejudices rather than challenging them. Daniel watched with fascination as educated adults struggled to reconcile their stated faith with their unstated assumptions about racial hierarchy. Sheriff Crenshaw's patience was wearing thin as he recognized the potential for this philosophical discussion to mask preparations for violence. His lawman's instincts told him that prolonged confrontations in public spaces inevitably escalated beyond verbal sparring, especially when alcohol and wounded pride were involved. "Folks, I appreciate everyone's passion for their beliefs, but I've got a responsibility to maintain order in this town," he announced with professional firmness. "Mr. Steelridge, I'm going to ask you to take Daniel back to your ranch while we sort through these community tensions. Let things cool down before someone says or does something that can't be taken back." The suggestion was reasonable from a law enforcement perspective, but Steelridge understood that retreating now would be interpreted as weakness by those who opposed his position. The delicate balance of frontier politics required him to maintain his ground while avoiding unnecessary confrontation, demonstrating strength without providing pretext for violent retaliation. "Sheriff, Daniel and I have business to conduct at the bank regarding his employment documentation," Steelridge replied with calm determination. "We'll leave town when our business is finished, but we won't be driven out by threats from men who mistake volume for virtue. Law and order means protecting the rights of all citizens, not just those who shout the loudest." The announcement that Daniel's employment would be formalized through legal banking procedures sent ripples of shock through both supportive and opposing factions. This was no longer a temporary arrangement based on Steelridge's whim, but a permanent economic relationship that would establish precedent throughout the territory and create legal protections that would be difficult to challenge. Morrison's desperation reached new heights as he realized that legal channels and social pressure had failed to achieve his objectives, leaving him with increasingly dangerous alternatives. "You're making a mistake, Steelridge, a big mistake. There are folks in this territory who won't stand for what you're doing. Folks with more backbone than these townspeople who lick your boots for scraps from your table." The threat was vague, but unmistakable, referring to elements beyond Bronco Springs, whose opposition to racial integration might take forms more violent than legal challenges or public protests. Daniel felt a chill of recognition, remembering similar warnings in other towns where his presence had generated conflict that escalated beyond individual disagreements into organized resistance as the immediate standoff began to dissolve. With Morrison's supporters drifting away under the combined pressure of legal authority and community disapproval, Daniel noticed groups of men gathering at the edges of the crowd. Their conversations were too quiet to overhear, but their body language suggested planning and coordination that might manifest in more dangerous forms than public confrontation. The visit to the bank proceeded under the watchful eyes of townspeople, whose reactions ranged from supportive to hostile, with many displaying the careful neutrality of those who recognized that taking sides in this conflict could have lasting economic consequences. Herbert Hawthorne's professional demeanor couldn't quite mask his personal discomfort as he processed the paperwork that would establish Daniel as an official employee of the Steel Ridge organization. The account is established, Hawthorne announced with professional neutrality, his banker's training evident in the precise handling of legal documents. Mr. Fireheart will have access to standard employee benefits and banking services. All documentation has been properly filed with territorial authorities in accordance with federal employment regulations. The formal language couldn't disguise the revolutionary nature of what had just occurred. A Cherokee teenager now possessed the same legal standing as any white employee, with documented proof of his status that would be difficult for opponents to challenge through official channels. The precedent established by this transaction would inevitably influence similar situations throughout the territory. As they prepared to leave town, Dr. Hartwell approached with medical concerns that transcended the political implications of the day's events, her physician's training making her acutely aware of the psychological and physical stress that such confrontations created. Mrs. Steelridge, I'm worried about potential retaliation against Daniel. The men who opposed you today aren't likely to accept this outcome peacefully. You need to take precautions, both for his safety and for your own. The warning proved prophetic when Carlos Mendoza met them at the edge of town with disturbing intelligence that transformed what had seemed like a successful day into the opening moves of a potentially deadly conflict. Center Steelridge, riders have been seen near the ranch boundaries. They're not rustlers or drifters, they're organized and armed. Miguel counted at least 15 men camped in the hills above the north pasture. The news carried implications that went far beyond individual threats, suggesting that Daniel's presence had attracted attention from elements willing to use organized violence to maintain racial boundaries. Someone with resources and connections was coordinating resistance that transcended local opposition. Steelridge's expression hardened as he processed the implications of organized opposition to his authority on his own land, his mind shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through countless frontier dangers. How well armed are they? Any indication of their intentions or leadership? Better armed than rustlers, not as well equipped as cavalry. Carlos replied with the precision of someone who had served in the Mexican-American War before settling into ranch life. They've got rifles, plenty of ammunition, but no heavy weapons or military organization. Still dangerous, especially if they're planning night raids or attempting to isolate the ranch from outside support. Daniel felt the familiar weight of guilt that had haunted him throughout his travels. The knowledge that his presence inevitably brought conflict to people who had shown him kindness. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar. Acceptance followed by organized opposition that threatened everyone who had supported him. Mr. Steelridge, I should leave before this gets worse, he said quietly, his voice heavy with the burden of causing problems for others. I won't have your family hurt because of me. My grandmother always said that sometimes the best way to honor someone's kindness is to remove the danger your presence creates. The suggestion brought immediate rejection from both Steelridge and Maria, their response revealing how deeply they had committed to the principles they had chosen to defend. This conflict had evolved beyond individual charity into a fundamental test of whether justice could prevail over violence in a territory still defining its character. Running would accomplish nothing except to encourage every other group that wants to challenge legitimate authority through intimidation, Maria pointed out with clinical precision. We either stand for law and order or we surrender to mob rule. There's no middle ground between civilization and chaos. As they rode toward the ranch under the watchful eyes of Carlos's scouts, Daniel understood that his brief taste of normalcy was ending. The comfortable routine of work, family meals, and plans for the future was being replaced by the harsh realities of frontier conflict, where survival often depended on the willingness to fight for what you believed. Regardless of the personal cost, 3 days of siege had transformed Steel Ridge Ranch from a symbol of prosperity into a fortress under constant surveillance, with armed men patrolling the perimeter while families huddled inside buildings that had never been designed to withstand prolonged assault. The attackers, led by a mysterious figure known only as the Colonel, had proved more organized and persistent than anyone had anticipated, cutting telegraph lines, poisoning water sources, and systematically destroying property while avoiding direct confrontation that might bring territorial authorities into the conflict. Daniel stood at the window of the main house, watching smoke rise from the burned-out remains of the equipment barn, his guilt weighing heavier than the rifle Carlos had pressed into his hands the night before. Every act of destruction reinforced his conviction that his presence had brought ruin to people who deserved better, while the careful strategy displayed by their attackers suggested opposition that went far beyond local prejudice into something approaching military coordination. "They're trying to force us into making the first aggressive move," Steelridge explained to his assembled defenders, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had survived similar conflicts during his early years in the territory. "The moment we ride out to attack their positions, they can claim self-defense and bring in federal authorities to investigate territorial violence against legitimate citizens. We have to be smarter than that." Maria had converted the dining room into a field hospital, her medical supplies arrayed with military precision as she prepared to treat whatever casualties the escalating conflict might produce. Her calm efficiency couldn't disguise the strain of knowing that her husband's principles might cost them everything they had built together, including their lives. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused everyone to freeze, weapons raised, and nerves stretched to breaking point, until Carlos's voice called out from the perimeter with news that would change everything. "Riders approaching from the south, but they're flying a white flag. Looks like someone wants to parley." The delegation that approached the ranch house included faces that Daniel recognized from his brief time in Bronco Springs, but their purpose remained unclear until Sheriff Crenshaw dismounted and requested permission to speak privately with Steelridge. The lawman's presence suggested that official authority was finally taking an interest in the conflict, though whether as mediator or enforcer remained to be determined. "Gus," Crenshaw began, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome news, "I've got a federal marshal on his way from Austin with orders to investigate reports of armed insurrection in this territory. Someone's been sending telegrams to Washington, claiming that you're harboring fugitive Indians and preparing to resist federal authority with violence." The accusation was sophisticated enough to threaten everything Steelridge had accomplished, using legitimate government channels to transform a local dispute into a federal case that could result in military intervention. Daniel realized that their unknown opponent possessed both legal knowledge and political connections that elevated this conflict far beyond frontier vigilantism. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Steelridge asked with the calm calculation of someone accustomed to facing existential threats to his empire. "And what exactly does Washington think is happening here?" Crenshaw's expression revealed the complexity of forces now arrayed against them. "Federal marshal arrives tomorrow morning with a full company of cavalry. They've been told to expect armed resistance from a cattle baron who's gone native and is preparing to establish some kind of independent Cherokee kingdom on Texas soil." The absurdity of the charges would have been laughable under other circumstances, but Daniel understood that truth mattered less than perception when federal forces were involved. Someone had crafted a narrative that transformed Steelridge's humanitarian gesture into an act of territorial rebellion requiring military suppression. Dr. Hartwell, who had ridden out with the sheriff's delegation, provided additional intelligence that revealed the scope of the conspiracy they were facing. The whole territory's buzzing with rumors about Indian uprising, cattle theft, and armed rebellion. Whoever's orchestrating this campaign knows exactly how to manipulate frontier fears and federal paranoia. As the delegation prepared to return to town, Timothy Fletcher stepped forward with information that would prove crucial to understanding their enemy's identity and motivations. The young blacksmith's apprentice had been conducting his own investigation, using his position as someone beneath adult notice to gather intelligence about the mysterious colonel. "Mr. Steelridge," Timothy said with the earnest intensity of Youth confronting injustice. I know who's behind this. It's Colonel Jeremiah Ashford, the man who owned the big ranch north of here before it went bankrupt 3 years ago. He's been living in Austin, working with federal Indian agents and political folks who want to make examples out of anyone who challenges their authority. The revelation transformed the entire conflict from random frontier violence into targeted revenge by someone with both motive and means to destroy Steel Ridge's empire. Ashford's bankruptcy had resulted from poor management and excessive gambling, but he had publicly blamed his failure on Steel Ridge's competitive practices and territorial favoritism toward successful ranchers. Maria's medical knowledge proved unexpectedly valuable as she provided psychological insight into their adversary's likely strategy. Ashford's a man who lost everything and needs someone to blame other than himself. He's found the perfect weapon in racial prejudice because it allows him to present personal revenge as patriotic duty. The analysis was interrupted by Carlos's urgent signal from the watchtower, where he had spotted new activity among the besieging forces. They're moving into position for something bigger than harassment, he called down. Looks like they're preparing for a coordinated assault, probably timed to coincide with the federal marshal's arrival. Steel Ridge's strategic mind immediately grasped the implications of Ashford's timing. He wants the cavalry to arrive in the middle of a firefight, with us appearing to resist federal authority while harboring fugitive Indians. It would justify whatever measures they decided to take against us. Daniel had been listening to these revelations with growing determination, his grandmother's voice echoing across the years with lessons about courage and sacrifice that seemed directly relevant to their current crisis. The time for passive acceptance had passed. If he was going to be the catalyst for this conflict, he needed to be part of its resolution. I have an idea, Daniel announced, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised everyone present. But it requires trusting me to do something. That might seem like abandoning everything we fought for. Are you willing to hear me out? The plan that Daniel outlined was audacious enough to leave his listeners speechless, requiring split-second timing and absolute faith in the power of moral authority to overcome military force. It depended on transforming the narrative from armed rebellion into something federal authorities couldn't ignore. A clear case of attempted lynching, prevented only by the intervention of legitimate territorial authority. You want to surrender yourself to Ashford's men? Steel Ridge asked, his voice filled with disbelief at the apparent suicide mission Daniel was proposing. Son, that's not courage, that's martyrdom. And dead martyrs don't build the kind of future your grandmother envisioned. Daniel's response revealed the depth of strategic thinking that his time at the ranch had developed, combining Cherokee wisdom with lessons learned from observing Steel Ridge's business methods. I want to force Ashford to reveal his true nature in front of federal witnesses who can't ignore what they're seeing. Sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is to let them defeat themselves. The following morning brought the arrival of Federal Marshal Douglas Clayton, accompanied by Captain William Harrison and 50 cavalry troopers whose presence transformed the conflict from local dispute into a matter of national significance. Clayton's reputation for fairness and competence had preceded him, suggesting that federal intervention might provide opportunity rather than disaster. As the federal delegation approached the ranch house under flag of truce, Daniel prepared to implement the most dangerous gamble of his young life. His plan required precise timing and absolute faith in the fundamental decency of men, sworn to uphold justice, regardless of their personal prejudices. Marshal Clayton, Steel Ridge called out as the federal officer dismounted. I appreciate your willingness to investigate this situation personally, rather than relying on second-hand reports. There are some things you need to see and hear before making any decisions about federal intervention. Clayton's weathered face revealed the skepticism of someone who had investigated countless frontier disputes where truth was usually the first casualty. Mr. Steel Ridge, I've received reports of armed insurrection and illegal harboring of fugitive Indians. I'm here to determine whether federal intervention is necessary to restore order and enforce territorial law. The formal language couldn't disguise Clayton's genuine desire to understand the situation before taking action, providing Daniel with the opening he needed to set his plan in motion. "Marshal, before you make any determinations about my legal status, I'd like to surrender myself voluntarily to demonstrate that I'm not a fugitive from justice." The unexpected offer caught everyone off guard, including Ashford's men who had been positioned to observe the federal investigation. Daniel's willingness to submit to arrest transformed him from dangerous rebel into cooperative citizen seeking protection under law. Furthermore, Daniel continued with the eloquence that never failed to surprise those who expected Cherokee. "Ignorance, I request that any proceedings against me be conducted in full view of territorial citizens, so that everyone can see how federal justice operates when racial prejudice attempts to corrupt legal process." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, appealing to Clayton's professional pride while making it impossible for him to conduct secretive proceedings that might later be questioned by higher authorities. Federal marshals built their careers on transparent enforcement of legitimate law. As Daniel prepared to accompany the federal delegation to town, Maria stepped forward with medical evidence that would prove crucial to the final resolution of the conflict. "Marshal Clayton, before you make any decisions about this young man's legal status, I believe you should examine the medical evidence of what he's endured during his journey to our territory." The examination that followed revealed the full scope of hardships Daniel had suffered, from malnutrition and exposure to injuries that spoke of violence encountered in other communities. Clayton's expression grew increasingly grim as he realized that the dangerous fugitive described in federal reports was actually a teenage victim of systematic persecution. The procession to Bronco Springs became a public demonstration of federal authority that forced community members to choose sides openly rather than hiding behind anonymous threats and nighttime violence. Daniel rode beside Marshal Clayton with dignity that transformed him from object of pity into symbol of courage. While Ashford's carefully orchestrated campaign began to unravel under the scrutiny of legitimate law enforcement, the town square had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom where federal authority would determine not just Daniel's fate, but the future direction of territorial justice. Citizens who had remained neutral during the earlier conflicts now found themselves forced to take public positions that would define their community's character. Colonel Ashford's appearance confirmed Timothy Fletcher's intelligence about their mysterious enemy, revealing a man whose bitterness and desperation had evolved into something approaching madness. His expensive clothes couldn't disguise the hollow eyes and trembling hands of someone whose need for revenge had consumed everything else in his life. Marshal Clayton. Ashford began with the practiced rhetoric of someone accustomed to political manipulation. "You're looking at a clear case of territorial defiance of federal Indian policy. This boy's presence outside reservation boundaries violates explicit federal law, while Steel Ridge's protection of him constitutes active resistance to government authority." The accusations were delivered with legal precision that revealed Ashford's preparation for this moment. But Daniel's response demonstrated how much he had learned during his time with the Steel Ridge family about the power of truth spoken with confidence. "Marshal, I carry valid employment authorization from territorial authorities and have committed no crimes against federal or territorial law. If my presence here violates federal policy, then the territorial government itself stands in violation of Washington's directives." The constitutional challenge forced Clayton to consider implications that went far beyond individual cases to fundamental questions about federal versus territorial authority. Ruling against Daniel would require him to declare that territorial governors lacked authority granted to them by federal appointment. Sheriff Crenshaw provided crucial testimony about the systematic harassment and violence that had characterized opposition to Daniel's presence, describing illegal activities that clearly violated federal law regardless of anyone's feelings about racial integration. "Marshal, we've had armed groups operating outside legal authority, destroying property and threatening violence against citizens engaged in lawful activities. The evidence that emerged during the impromptu hearing painted a clear picture of conspiracy to use violence and intimidation to subvert legal authority, transforming Ashford from patriotic defender of federal law into criminal insurrector whose actions threatened territorial stability. Dr. Hartwell's medical testimony provided scientific evidence of Daniel's physical condition that contradicted every stereotype about Cherokee character and capability, while her professional reputation lent credibility to observations about his intelligence, work ethic, and moral character. As the hearing progressed, community members began stepping forward with their own testimony about Daniel's behavior during his time in Bronco Springs. Even some who had initially opposed his presence found themselves admitting that his actual conduct contradicted their preconceptions about Cherokee nature. Mrs. Hawthorne's testimony proved particularly powerful because of her known prejudices, lending unexpected credibility to her reluctant admission that Daniel's behavior had been consistently respectful and peaceful. "Marshal, I cannot honestly say that the boy has caused any trouble or demonstrated the savage characteristics that we were led to expect." The turning point came when Timothy Fletcher presented evidence he had gathered about Ashford's financial backing for the harassment campaign, revealing connections to political figures who viewed territorial independence as a threat to federal control. The conspiracy extended far beyond personal revenge into systematic resistance to territorial self-governance. Marshal Clayton's decision reflected both legal analysis and moral conviction, demonstrating that federal authority could serve justice rather than oppression when exercised by principled men. Based on the evidence presented, I find no violation of federal law in Mr. Fireheart's presence in this territory. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full federal investigation into conspiracy to violate civil rights through intimidation and violence. The announcement transformed the town square from courtroom into celebration as citizens realized that federal intervention had protected rather than destroyed their community's autonomy. Daniel's courage in facing the investigation had exposed the true threat to territorial stability. As federal troops arrested Ashford and his conspirators, Daniel found himself surrounded by townspeople whose attitudes had been permanently changed by witnessing the contrast between his dignity and his accuser's desperation. The boy who had once been scorned for sleeping outside the saloon was now recognized as someone whose character had helped define their community's moral foundation. Steel Ridge's pride in Daniel's development was evident as he watched the young man handle success with the same grace he had shown in facing persecution. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said quietly. "You've proved that Cherokee blood can succeed in any man's world when given a fair chance." The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with citizens who had once demanded Daniel's removal now competing to demonstrate their acceptance of him as a permanent member of their community. The transformation wasn't complete or universal, but it represented genuine progress toward the inclusive society that Steel Ridge and Maria had envisioned. As Daniel stood on the steps where he had once knelt in hunger and desperation, now surrounded by friends and supporters, he understood that his grandmother's faith had been justified. The journey from Cherokee Nation to this moment of triumph had cost more than he could have imagined, but it had proved that determination and dignity could overcome even the most entrenched prejudice. The final image of Daniel Fireheart walking proudly down the main street of Bronco Springs, head held high and future secure, served as testament to the power of courage to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities willing to choose justice over fear.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.